It was the mid-1970s, and the drummer and singer of an English progressive rock band decided one day to take a walk along the beach. It was brisk for a late summer day, but Phil Collins needed to get some air. He had a lot on his mind as of late. He was in the middle of trying to cement himself as more than just the drummer, but also the new lead singer of the prog rock outfit Genesis, following Peter Gabriel's departure. As Collins strolled leisurely by himself down the windy stretch of sand, he witnessed some commotion out in the ocean water. Collins was startled, and after closer examination, realized it was a man drowning. Collins didn't know what to do. He ran through the options quickly in his head. He was far away, and no one was around. No one was saving this man. Should he risk drowning himself in an attempt to help him? Maybe he should call someone. It was in that instant, out of the corner of his eye, Collins realized that there was indeed a dock nearby, and on that dock was a man. Collins drew a quick sigh of relief. Obviously, this other man was there to help the victim. But as each second passed, and as the drowning man proceeded to get more desperate with each flailing arm, it became clear that this man on the dock was doing nothing. He was not even attempting to reach the helpless man, to hand the guy a stick, to call out for anyone. Nothing. Collins attempted to scream at the man to do something, anything, but he just stood there, almost as if Collins wasn't even there, with a blank, dull look on his face. Collins was shocked and felt helpless, and in an instant, the flailing stopped. The splashing stopped, and the commotion stopped. The man had drowned. Collins didn't know what to do. He was stunned. He was so moved by the incident, he couldn't even bear himself to confront the man on the dock. Collins just stared at him, and as the dull expression in the man's face seared into his brain, all Collins could do was walk away in shock. As soon as he got back to his home, Collins did what any good artist does when encountering the extremes of life. He dove into his creativity and started writing a song. Collins was confused and angry and let out his emotions in his writing, and before he knew it, the song was written. It was a few weeks later when Collins was due to play a concert in the same city. He was still shook up by the incident. He couldn't forget it, so he took the matter into his own hands. He hired a private detective to find the man on the dock and to give him a free ticket to this upcoming show. The ticket was for the front, right near the stage. The show kicked off, and Phil recognized the man right away. After performing a few songs, Collins decided to debut this new song he had written about the drowning incident. Before he performed it, though, he explained the incident to the crowd and had the light crew shine a spotlight on this man, singling out this person who could have saved another man from drowning. Collins stared into his eyes as he debuted this new song. It was called "In the Air Tonight." The man in the crowd was so shook up from the public shaming, he immediately went home after the show and committed suicide. What a story. It's almost as if it were too good to be true. Well, actually, that's exactly the case. It is too good to be true. The story is completely made up, but for some reason, the story behind the song "In the Air Tonight" has generated so much folklore, a lot of people believe it. Some variations of the story say it was actually Phil and a friend on a boat when his friend went overboard and drowned, and Phil was unable to save him. Some say Phil tried to save the drowning victim, and when reaching out his hand, Phil realized it was the rapist of his current wife, so he let go and let him drown. There's countless variations to the urban legend, when in truth, Collins was actually just in the middle of divorce proceedings and wrote this song amidst the grief and despair he was experiencing, even saying he didn't really know what the song was about himself, writing the lyrics spontaneously. What is it with mythology and mystery that is so attractive? Why do we want to believe the drowning story and not the actual truth? It's that mystery that has surrounded artists for generations, and it's part of the artistic process that we love. And now that we're in the age of reality television and YouTube vlogs and Instagram pages, we've lost most of that. Gone are the days where you didn't know the personal lives of your favorite artist, when you didn't know if David Bowie was a man, a woman, or an alien, or if Mama Cass really did die from choking on a ham sandwich, or if Robert Johnson really sold his soul to the devil to be able to play guitar like no other man alive. It's those urban legends and myths that used to make rock music so attractive and interesting. And yes, I do recognize the hypocrisy in me romanticizing about the old days, coming from a guy who has a podcast solely based on providing detailed information on the stories behind albums. That's just the world we live in today, in the age of information. But it doesn't mean I can't look back on those myths and appreciate them. Well, one band in recent memory knew the power of mythology. They knew the importance of mystery behind an artist and appreciated it. And what they did is carefully craft a mythology and a story around them. They didn't get crazy with it, but they wanted to present an artifice of the band and have control over what their public perception would be. They were anything but typical coming out of the post-Nirvana, post-Oasis, post-grunge scene of the late 90s. They were the last great, mysterious band in rock and roll. They were the White Stripes. And the mythology surrounding Jack and Meg White allowed them to get away with playing the music they truly loved. A weird new take on blues music mixed in with a flavor of their hometown, Detroit, Michigan. It was something later labeled as garage rock, and one of the defining albums that represented the early 2000s garage rock scene was the White Stripes' fourth record, Elephant.
The stories behind some of the most famous albums in music history. It's Beyond the Beat with Jared Lennon.
Dave Grohl of Nirvana and the Foo Fighters once said, "The easiest songs to play are the hardest to make." Well, no one accused Jack White of taking the easy route in his songwriting. It was 2002, and the White Stripes were on tour in Australia in support of their third album, White Blood Cells. The lead singer and guitarist was on stage with his partner in crime, his only bandmate, drummer Meg White, when he had a thought for a song. Jack thought it would be interesting to challenge himself on writing something without a chorus. As he messed around with his guitar on stage, he came up with a simple little riff played on one string. It almost sounded like a bass riff. Jack played around with it for a while and loved the simplicity of it. He didn't come up with words, melody, or a structure, and actually didn't particularly like the rhythm of it, but he knew something was there. Maybe it wasn't good enough for his standards in the White Stripes, but to Jack, it sounded like a theme for a future James Bond movie. Who knew? Maybe he'd be asked one day to write a song for the movie series. And so he carried on the tour with that simple riff stored in the memory bank, naming it after a mispronunciation he had as a kid for the charity Salvation Army. As a boy, he called it Seven Nation Army. A few months went by, and it was now time to record another album. It was April of 2002, and the White Stripes were now trying to record a follow-up to an album that gave them their first taste of mainstream success in White Blood Cells. Jack and Meg decided upon a studio in Hackney, London, England, called Toe Rag Studios. It wasn't a famous studio by any stretch, and it didn't have a lot of history, but what caught Jack's eye was the antiquated equipment and its attention to analog recording, as opposed to digital, which was the going trend at the time. And it was there where that little James Bond-sounding riff took form. Realizing the absurdity of ever thinking he'd be asked to write the theme song for a James Bond movie, he decided to incorporate it with the White Stripes. Because of the White Stripes' small brush with mainstream success, Jack's headspace and inspiration for lyrics was very much in that realm. After the release of their last album, they were relentless in their touring schedule, and when they came back home to Detroit, Michigan, people were starting to treat them differently. They were no longer these hometown heroes that the garage rock hipsters adored. In their eyes, they had sold out. They were too popular now. And so Jack went into this new recording session in London, England, with that frame of mind. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Jack explained how he came up with the lyrics to Seven Nation Army, saying, quote, That song started out about two specific people I knew in Detroit. It was about gossip, the spreading of lies, and the other person's reaction to it. It came from a frustration of watching my friends do this to each other. In the end, it started to become a metaphor for things I was going through. And so with a starting point, the title, Seven Nation Army, Jack gathered his thoughts on what his friends were experiencing at that time, and took it sideways from there. And you can hear the anger behind the message. In the second verse, he writes, "Don't want to hear about it. Every single one's got a story to tell. Everyone knows about it, from the Queen of England to the hounds of hell. And if I catch it coming back my way, I'm going to serve it to you. And that ain't what you want to hear, but that's what I'll do. And the feeling coming from my bones says find a home." It's quite obviously Jack's disgust for people talking behind other people's back. In the third verse, a topic comes up that is a common theme in Jack's songwriting, his reverence for blue-collar work and the Midwestern United States. Jack writes about his fantasy of leaving all this gossip and fame bullshit behind and moving to the Midwest to work a regular job. But he's conflicted about it. Moving away would also crush the biggest love he has in his life, his creativity. And so even though he fantasizes about moving, deep down he knows he's not really going to do it. He writes, "I'm going to Wichita, far from this opera forevermore. I'm going to work this straw, make the sweat drip out of every pore. And I'm bleeding, and I'm bleeding, and I'm bleeding, right before the Lord. All the words are going to bleed from me, and I will sing no more. And the stains coming from my blood tell me go back home." The lyrics are great, but it's not what makes this song stand out. It's not what makes the White Stripes stand out, for that matter. It's the emotion they invoke in their songs. And with Seven Nation Army, it's the dynamic between the quieter verses and Jack's anger in his vocal compared to the chorus, or lack of chorus, in the big slide guitar solo. And what's the backbone of it all? It's that James Bond riff, maybe the best riff to come out of the 2000s. It sounds like a bass guitar, but it's actually Jack's semi-acoustic guitar brought down an octave by a guitar pedal, and a riff that has come to outlive the song itself. It has transcended music and entered the realm of Queen's We Will Rock You and Gary Glitter's Rock and Roll as a sports anthem. Before that, though, it was the White Stripes' most commercially successful single to date. The song won them a Grammy for Best Rock Song. It held top spot on the Billboard Alternative Rock chart for 3 weeks and eventually became the third best performing song of the decade. And that all helped it enter the minds of rabid sports fans. It all started that same year, 2003, but well after Seven Nation Army's peak for radio play. It was October, and a Belgium soccer team was hosting a Champions League match. The Belgium fans started chanting the riff while pre-drinking before the game in the bars, and later brought it into the stadium where it caught fire. From then on, the fans chanted it after every goal. It was short, catchy, and you didn't need to be sober to join in. It later became a theme for the Italians when they won the 2006 World Cup in soccer. But it quickly moved past just soccer games and is now heard at football, baseball, basketball, hockey, and all major sports games. Jack spoke about its impact on the sports world in an interview and talked about how the sports arena is a great metaphor for church gatherings in the past, where original folk songs were shared and took shape, saying, quote, "You couldn't ask for anything better as a songwriter. For something like that to happen naturally, it's become a folk song in a way. That's what folk music is. It's for people, say, like in Appalachia, if they're playing some song, they don't really know who wrote the song or where it came from. Their uncle used to play this on the fiddle, on the front porch, and now we play it, and now our grandkids are going to play it. That's folk music, and I think that's that song. And a matter of fact, when we recorded it, we didn't think much of that song. We moved on to the next thing very fast. So it's amazing that that naturally caught on to people." What's interesting is how Seven Nation Army stands out among those classic sports anthems and classic folk songs. Most folk songs are remembered by the lyrics, or big sports songs like We Will Rock You are remembered for its stomping and clapping. But Seven Nation Army is chanted as purely a melody. Seven Nation Army became a career-changing hit for the White Stripes. Although their first taste of the mainstream was with White Blood Cells, the single Seven Nation Army solidified the band in pop culture. It proved they were more than a one-hit wonder, and it set the White Stripes apart from their garage rock counterparts. It was the first garage rock song to hit number 1 on the modern rock charts. And what better song to expose the White Stripes to people worldwide? It kind of sums up the band in the 3 minutes and 52 seconds it takes up on Elephant. It's simple. Both the guitar work and drums are as primitive as it gets. The focus is on the music, not necessarily the lyrics. There's no Jimi Hendrix guitar solo. It's just loud, in-your-face distortion. You hear the garage rock Detroit, Iggy and The Stooges influence with a hint of old-school blues. And that's exactly what you're getting pretty consistently with the White Stripes. The White Stripes were formed in 1997 in Jack and Meg's hometown of Detroit, Michigan. Jack, who was born John Gillis, was a high school senior when he first met Meg White in 1994. Jack was attending an open mic poetry night at the restaurant Meg worked at called the Memphis Smoke. Jack was playing in a band called Goober and the Peas at the time, but as a drummer, not a guitarist. They hit it off quite quickly, started dating, and by September of 1996, they were married. Untraditionally, Jack took her last name. By the time they were married, Goober and the Peas had disbanded, so Jack quit doing music full-time and went to work as a furniture upholsterer while Meg continued bartending. Meg was always a big lover of music, but never a musician. According to the White Stripes mythology, Meg sat behind Jack's drum kit for the first time on Bastille Day of 1997, July 14th. Jack grabbed a guitar, and it turned into the first jam for what would be the White Stripes. Jack later looked back at that memory in an interview, saying, quote, "When she started to play drums with me, just on a lark, it felt liberating and refreshing. There was something in it that opened me up." Jack needed to give Meg a few pointers at first as she never played the drums before, but she had a natural rhythm and took to it quickly. In an interview years later, Jack explained how Meg's drumming really shaped the sound of the White Stripes, saying, quote, "She sort of played like a child because she never played drums before, and it seemed to be something that was really interesting right off the bat. I became really obsessed with it. I didn't want to change. I didn't want her to practice. I wanted it to stay childlike. It's sort of that thing Picasso saying it'll take you a lifetime to learn how to paint like a child. I couldn't drum like that if I wanted to. I'd never played with a drummer like that. So it was very primitive and primal. So we stayed with it. We started writing songs. It came together really nicely. It became a great way for me to play the blues too and get away with it." And so it would be Bastille Day 1997 where the White Stripes were born. They wanted to call themselves the Peppermints because of Meg's love for the candy, but since both of their last names were White, the White Stripes had a better ring to it. Just how Jack loved the way Meg played the drums, Jack loved the childlike name of the White Stripes as well. And it was in those early days that they were crafting a mythology to the band. They wanted the attention they were getting to be on the music and not on their personal lives. They knew that if it was well known that they were a married couple, it would draw negative attention away from the music. They decided to present themselves as brother and sister. It would have the added effect of making it interesting if people thought they were a family, bonded for life, as opposed to wondering how they were coping being in a band together as a married couple. And they kept this rift up for years, even after it came out in the press that they were actually married. It only added to the mystique of the band. In August of 1997, a month after their first jam and deciding on a band name, they played their first full gig at the Gold Dollar Bar in Detroit. Initially, they fit right into a growing music scene in Michigan at the time, the underground garage rock scene. They played shows with similar bands in the genre, and they caught the attention of an independent Detroit-based garage punk record label called Italy Records. The label helped Jack and Meg produce their first single on vinyl, called Let's Shake Hands, in February of 1998, followed by their second single, Lafayette Blues, that October. Only 1,000 copies were made of each. It wasn't until the following year, though, when they caught the attention of a bigger record label out of California called Sympathy for the Record Industry. That led to their first album, self-titled as The White Stripes, in June of 1999. The sound is gritty, the songs are short and to the point, and they just sound like a couple of people rocking out in a garage. Jack has mentioned that this is the record they never truly topped because of its Detroit sound. And it was led by the first single, The Big Three Killed My Baby. In the lyrics, Jack wrote about the big three automakers in Detroit, Chrysler, Ford, and GM. It's about his frustration with those corporations and their focus on profits and cutting costs. their short-sighted take on innovation, all at the expense of the safety of the vehicles. It was Jack's attempt at being controversial and provocative. The Detroit influence is also evident in the music. You hear straightforward garage rock, the raw version of rock and roll they present, the basic chord structures, the distorted guitar, the aggressive lyrics, and the simplified rhythms that a lot of Detroit bands of the past have made famous. In an interview years later, Jack talked about how much his hometown had an influence on him in those early years of the band, saying, quote, "When I look back at what we did, the music we did, it sounds very Detroit to me. It sounds like what I thought in my mind as a teenager what Detroit rock and roll was. The Stooges, or MC5, or whatever it was. That's what I felt like what was happening when we first started recording." Jack has even said that the Iggy and The Stooges album of Funhouse is his favorite rock album of all time. If we cut ahead again to their fourth album, Elephant, you hear that Detroit sound and garage rock influence even 4 years after their debut album. That leads us to the second song off Elephant, called Black Math. It's a garage rock banger, start to finish. The combination of Jack's distorted guitar, his distorted vocal take, his aggressive lyrics, and Meg's steady crash cymbals all provide a wall of sound for most of the song. Jack keeps the listener's attention throughout the song by using a common technique he's used quite often during his career. He throws an interesting tempo change into the middle of it. It's those techniques that are hard to organize when you have a large band, and it's a part of why he kept just him and Meg as the only band members. It allowed him to insert those changes confidently and have it easily translatable when they play the songs live, as opposed to relying on a bunch of musicians having to remember it. Jack slows down the song in the middle of it and changes up the distortion in his guitar. It builds all this anticipation until the high riff part, which releases all the tension and gets the song back on track to the fast-paced banger that it is. Both parts are made better by the other, and Jack rips a quintessential Jack White guitar solo in the middle of it all. It's simple, but raw and sloppy in all the best ways. For the lyrics, Jack sings about the frustration he had growing up in the formal American education system. Jack explained it in an interview, saying, quote, "I was thinking about a time in high school when I turned my books into the math teacher and said, 'I refuse to learn from you anymore.' The song is about asking questions. A lot of people are taught just to regurgitate information. People don't care if you learn anymore. Opinion gets trampled on." Jack writes about drowning in a sea of books, words, and concepts that he doesn't really understand. It's a little satirical, as Jack is almost proud that he can write down things that he doesn't understand, with the lyrics, "My books are sitting at the top of the stack now. The longer words are really breaking my back now. Yeah, maybe I'll learn to understand, drawing a square with a pencil in hand." Jack's take is kids learn how to do things they don't want to do, and kids are only taught to remember information. The lyrics complain about black fingers from too much writing with ink, and Jack writes, "Listen, master, can you answer a question? Is it the fingers or the brain that you're teaching the lesson?" Meaning that the teaching he has received has little to do with understanding and more to do with writing down a lot of meaningless nonsense. Finally, he writes that he'd rather learn applicable real-world knowledge on his own, writing, "Maybe I'll put my love on ice and teach myself. Maybe that'll be nice." Black Math was never released as a single, but the second track off of Elephant became a concert staple for the White Stripes, being played 212 times in the history of the band. I mentioned Black Math having that classic heavy garage rock sound that bands like the Stooges and MC5 made famous coming out of Detroit. Another influence Detroit had on Elephant, albeit in quite a different way, leads us to the 10th track off the album, Little Acorns. Yes, it's another garage rock banger. Yes, it follows the simplicity of that Detroit sound, but Detroit contributed another way in lending the voice of one of the city's most famous broadcasters. It's introduced with a spoken word part by legendary news anchor Mort Krim, telling a story about a squirrel. Krim began doing newscasts in Detroit in 1978 and was an anchor all the way up until his retirement in 1997. Will Ferrell has admitted that Krim was the main inspiration for the lead character Ron Burgundy in his movie Anchorman. The spoken word section to introduce the song is an inspirational little story about a woman who was extremely down on her luck in life, but after witnessing a squirrel store up nuts for the winter, was inspired to turn her life around, saying, "She thought if that squirrel can take care of himself with the harsh winter coming on, so can I. Once I broke my problems into small pieces, I was able to carry them, just like those acorns, one at a time." It's a weird little part of the album that catches you off guard. It's by no means short either, with the story taking up close to a minute. I guess it shows the strangeness of Jack, but also how willing he was to take risks and to be bold on Elephant. And just as your mind might wander from the story, you're jolted by this heavy guitar and fuzz that has Detroit written all over it. It's so interesting to have the soothing voiceover make way into a killer riff and then have it followed up by this muted strumming part as the vocals kick in. Take all your problems and rip them apart, carry them off in a shopping cart. And another thing you should have known from the start, the problems in hand are lighter than at heart. Be like the squirrel girl, be like the squirrel. When you think of the White Stripes, you think of blues-tinged rock and roll scaled back to its most essential elements. One guitar, a simple drum kit, and sneering vocals. For the most part, Jack and Meg have been consistently disciplined in that regard for the band's sound. When they found success, you could imagine the temptation it would be to record in these massive, famous studios, to hire the best producers and engineers to expand their sound. But Jack has never been that type of guy. He thrives under limitation. The White Stripes saw mild success in the Detroit area after the release of their self-titled album, their first album back in 1999. But they never really made a ripple in the mainstream. They toured behind it a little bit and got right back to work and right back into recording a new album soon after. It was barely a year to the date of their first release where they would put out their second album, this one titled Stijl, on June 20th, 2000. Stijl really took everything that was great about their debut album and brought it to a new level by adding polished and pop sensibilities to their blues rock formula. This was the album that put the White Stripes on the map in a way, being well received critically and paving the way for their commercially well received next two albums. Stijl made the White Stripes an underground favorite. Stijl is a Dutch phrase meaning the style in English. It was a minimalist aesthetic movement that came out of Amsterdam in 1917, making its way to architecture and artwork. It simplified visuals to vertical and horizontal, using only black, white, and primary colors. Its focus was on reducing aesthetics to its bare essentials in shapes and colors. The movement was short-lived, but Jack took this school of thought to heart when he discovered it, well before the White Stripes were even a thing. Jack read about Stijl when he was working as a furniture upholsterer in his late teens. Its minimalist aesthetic had a profound influence first on his upholstery style, but he took that ethos and used it in his life as a whole. It goes to show how wise Jack was as a young man, understanding the dangers of too much freedom, the dangers of paralysis by analysis. In an interview years later, Jack explained what Stijl meant to him and how it transferred to the band, saying, quote, "The whole point of the White Stripes is the liberation of limiting yourself. In my opinion, too much opportunity kills creativity. I remember in high school, a friend of mine had a magazine with a story about some popular band of the time that was recording an album. The story said they had 80 guitars in the studio to choose from, and that there were over 120 tracks of guitar on this one song. Good Lord, listen to the Stooges' Funhouse. You know there can't be more than one track of guitar on there, maybe two." What's interesting about the White Stripes and adopting this minimalism aesthetic is it was coming at a period of time in the music industry where technology was really expanding the possibilities for artists and bands. The late 90s saw digital recording hit the mainstream and Pro Tools becoming an ever more popular recording technique. Recording music was becoming easier, but easier doesn't usually translate to good art, and Jack really understood this. The Beatles recorded Revolver and Sgt. Pepper on a 4-track recorder. With digital technology, musicians have the opportunity of unlimited tracks and unlimited recording takes. But Jack believed that opportunity is ultimately detrimental to artists. Jack likes to be boxed in, to have a box they have to fight out of, to purposefully constrict himself and Meg. Critics have given the White Stripes shit over the years for this constriction, labeling it lazy, labeling it as a rationalization for not using all the available tools to their advantage. But it's part of what makes them so strange, and I say that as a compliment. It adds to the mystery behind the band, and what's admirable is that for the most part, they never wavered from that minimalist ethos. And that brings us to the third song off of Elephant. It was the fourth and final single off the album. It's called There's No Home for You Here. And it's actually one of the few examples of Jack wavering a bit from that strict minimalism idea in the White Stripes. I think the average fan would be surprised to hear that this is the example of Jack trying to step out of the minimalist boundaries they have set for themselves. Jack talked about There's No Home for You Here in an interview, saying, quote, "Our idea was to see how far we could go with an 8-track recorder, and I think how far we went is too far." Now, if you heard that quote from Jack before hearing this song, you might think there's some crazy piano or synth parts in the song, maybe a wall of guitars, maybe even get crazy and add a bass guitar. But no, it's really just vocal harmonies that they added in. And they sound great, almost a hint of Beatles mixed in, something like off of Helter Skelter or I Want You, She's So Heavy. There's No Home for You Here opens with the powerful harmonies over top of the classic White Stripes sound of heavy guitars and drums. And the song follows a similar chord progression and a sound to a White Stripes song off their previous album, Dead Leaves and the Dirty Ground. It's almost like Dead Leaves Part 2. In hindsight, Jack says they went too far with it, but it's those vocals that separates this song from the others on this record. It adds a unique intensity and power to the song. There's No Home for You Here features bitter, cynical, and comical lyrics depicting the inner thoughts of a person bored with his lover and rejecting her. Jack writes with anger, but it's so detailed in a way that almost makes it funny. Jack sings, "I'd like to think that all of this constant interaction is just the kind to make you drive yourself away. Each simple gesture done by me is counteracted and leaves me standing here with nothing else to say, completely baffled by a backward indication that an inspired word will come across your tongue, hands moving upward to propel the situation have simply halted, now the conversation's done." And then with a simple line repeated in the chorus, "There's no home for you here, girl, go away, there's no home for you here." It's like he's trying to drive the girl away, but it's not working, and he's getting more and more frustrated. The lyrics get more comical in the bridge, and you hear the frustration growing further in Jack's voice and in his delivery, as he sings the lines, "Waking up for breakfast, burning matches, talking quickly, breaking baubles, throwing garbage, drinking soda, looking happy, taking pictures, so completely stupid, just go away." The song also features something unique for a White Stripes song other than the vocal harmonies. It's the electric piano. It's not prominent in the mix, but adds a nice touch to the background. But again, judging by Jack's comment on going too far with the 8-track recorder, it might have been a touch that Jack later regretted. For people who don't know what an 8-track recorder is or what multi-track recording is in general, it's basically a method of recording musicians use so they can record some or all of the instrumentation and vocals separately by themselves, and then have it spliced over top of each other after to create a cohesive track, instead of needing a band all together at the same time and in the same space and recording all the instrumentation and vocals in one take. Multi-track recording was developed in the mid-50s. Like I said, the Beatles only used a 4-track recorder up until the White Album, where they graduated to 8 tracks. Famously, the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album was on 8 tracks. 8-track recording became the industry standard until the early 70s, when 16-track recording became more available, and then it just kept growing and growing over the years. By 1982, technology allowed the band Toto to synchronize the use of 3 24-track machines together, and this was all before digital recording took off in the late 80s and 90s. So that puts Jack's 2003 comment in perspective of how serious he took minimalism, if he thinks 8-track recording was them going way too far. There's No Home for You Here was the record label's choice for first single off of Elephant, but Jack insisted on Seven Nation Army. Eventually, There's No Home for You Here became the album's 4th single, but failed to chart or make any commercial radio headway. Getting back to the lyrics in There's No Home for You Here, it's quite obviously Jack writing about his anger over a relationship with a girl, whether that's Jack writing from personal experience or if he's writing about a character, we don't know for sure. That's the tricky part about music, especially for a guy as mysterious as Jack likes to be. And there's no better word than mysterious to describe the relationship between Jack and Meg. In the press and on stage, they would always claim to be brother and sister, the youngest two siblings of 10. But a news article in 2001 came out that proved they were married back in 1996 and actually divorced in the year 2000. When that became public, still Jack and Meg carried on the trope that they were siblings, and when asked about the marriage, they wouldn't really answer the question straight on, kind of like what a politician would do. They never really lied, but they'd skirt the attention to something else in their answer. Jack and Meg carefully crafted the myth behind them being siblings right from the get-go in the White Stripes. As Jack explained in an interview after the news of their marriage leaked out, the reason was to divert attention away from their personal lives, saying, quote, "When you see a band that is two pieces, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, you think, oh, I see. When they're brother and sister, you go, oh, that's interesting. You care more about the music, not the relationship. Whether they're trying to save their relationship by being in a band, you don't think about that with a brother and sister. They're mated for life. That's what family is like." And it didn't just stop at carefully crafting what their personal relationship was in the media. As Jack says, every decision made in the White Stripes was in favor of focusing the attention on the music. Jack explained further, saying, quote, "Somebody who didn't really want to dig deep into us would say that we were super gimmicky. Oh, they dress in these colors, and they're a boy and a girl, and they're brother and sister, but people think they're really married. They could say that it's all just gimmicks. For us, the funniest thing is that that's so great. If that's what you think, then go away. It's perfect for us because it weeds out all the people who don't really love the honesty of music. It's a great uniform. The whole box that we're in repels a lot of ignorance." So as there's no home for you here on Elephant, some 3 years after they had been divorced, a song written about Meg from Jack's perspective? Who knows? Probably not. It's a pretty aggressive song that would have to be written about a bandmate you need to spend a lot of time with in the future, but it makes their story even more interesting. The craziest thing about that story is how they were able to put their personal history aside for the sake of the band and continue working together. It's not like they were even a huge band at the time. Why go on? Why would you want to be confined to a small van with just you and your ex-husband or ex-wife playing small clubs around the world? After their divorce in 2000, they continued touring behind Stijl. In February of 2001, they needed just 4 days to record what would be White Blood Cells, released that year in July. And that's the album that brought them their first taste of the mainstream. While not completely shedding the blues rock identity of their first couple albums, the White Stripes veered towards a much more minimalistic garage rock sound with White Blood Cells. The songs are still short and to the point, but with much more diversity and accessibility than the previous albums. On the whole, there isn't one guitar solo and there isn't one cover. The success of the album was largely driven by the second single, Fell in Love with a Girl. It was the band's first song on the US Alternative Songs chart, peaking at number 12, and it got heavy rotation on MTV with a unique video featuring stop video animation with Legos. One reviewer called the single an attention-grabbing chunk of primal punk rock confection that flames out in a breathless 1 minute and 50 seconds. The relatively small record label that they were on at the time, Sympathy for the Record Industry, weren't prepared for the hype and response to the release of White Blood Cells. It would eventually peak at number 61 on the Billboard 200, and it led to the White Stripes signing with a major label, V2 Records, who re-released the album in 2002, which brought it even more success. The cover art of White Blood Cells kind of signifies where the band was at that time in their career. It features Jack and Meg, both hounded and enamored by a clan of people wielding TV and video cameras. It was almost foreshadowing for the big time that was just around the corner for them. In an interview, Jack explained the cover and the album's name, White Blood Cells, saying, quote, "It was the way we were looked at in the garage rock scene at the time. Oh, look at what's happened to them. The people in black were the bacteria, we were the white blood cells. Is this attention good or bad? Who do you trust now?" But then it became more than a neighborhood scene problem. It became a global problem. You gotta think that discipline Jack and Meg employed for their music only helped them as they started to get more mainstream attention. They weren't the people with huge egos looking to get validated in the media or in the pop music realm. They had the practice of discipline in their minimalist ethos, and it helped them work through what must have been a crazy time after the success of White Blood Cells. Before they signed with a major record label, V2 Records, they knew that the music had to be put first, and their individual freedom to be artists to serve that music. They didn't want the big money and the big advances. They just didn't want to be told what songs are going to be on an album and what should be on the cover. There's one story from this era where they reportedly turned down $1 million for their song to be in a Gap commercial. Years later, Jack talked about these years and how they got through this sudden burst of fame, saying, quote, "I remember being in a minefield, always trying to avoid something, never feeling comfortable, even knowing about the people who had come before me and been through the same things. A lot of it is evil, and it doesn't matter how much you know and how much you've experienced. You have to keep pushing until you find your niche, your little spot. You never see me and Meg on a reality TV show. We don't go on MTV's Cribs. We don't walk down red carpets with our dates, exploiting relationships. We don't look for any of it. We avoid it." And so after touring behind White Blood Cells, not resting on any laurels, the White Stripes got right back into the studio in April of 2002, less than a year after the previous record release. And that album would eventually turn into Elephant, recorded over 2 weeks at Toreg Studios in London, England. If you look at Elephant, there's definitely similarities in the music from White Blood Cells, but it was really an album that could be the dividing marker in the history of the White Stripes. There was the before, the young, loud, and aggressive garage rock band with a hint of the blues, and then there's Elephant and what would come after, a more mature, fully realized, well-rounded version of what came before them. One review of Elephant said it had cemented their evolution from a blind Willie McTell cover band with a pop sensibility to full-fledged, honest-to-goodness rock and roll gods. And one track off of Elephant that has that White Blood Cells taste of the old White Stripes leads us to the song Hypnotize. It's a simple 1 minute and 48-second garage rocker about a guy trying to hook up with a woman. It's short, catchy, and raunchy, just like Fell in Love with a Girl. The lyrics feel honest, vulnerable, and confident all at the same time. In the first verse, Jack writes, "I want to hypnotize you, baby, on the telephone. So many times I called your house just to hear the tone. And though I know you weren't home, I didn't mind so much because I'm so alone. I want to hypnotize you, baby, on the telephone." It's about the guy thinking he's in charge first, saying that she's the kind of girl he could hypnotize, and then the tables turn and he tries to muster up the courage to, quote, hold her little hand. The song has a bluesy chord progression and feel to it, but it's fast and full of distortion. It's a classic, simple White Stripes song. 3 verses, no choruses, with a great heavy breakdown in the middle. Meg's drumming gives the song a great rhythm too. It's not technical by any means, but no White Stripes song is technical on the drums. It's part of what makes the White Stripes the White Stripes. You're never going to be blown away by Meg's drum prowess, but it's exactly the yin to Jack's guitar yang. It meshes with Jack's minimalist sensibility. It would take a lot of discipline to not want to show off the skills you have on an instrument while being in a 2-piece band. Meg deserves a lot more credit than she gets. Meg White was born in Grosse Pointe Farms in Michigan in 1974. She grew up in the Detroit suburb with her parents and older sister, and according to one high school classmate, was always the quiet, obviously artistic type, and she just kept very much to herself. While still in high school, she decided not to go to college and instead pursue a career as a chef. She began work at the Memphis Smoke, a restaurant in downtown Royal Oak, and it was there that she first met budding musician John Gillis. John, who would later go by Jack, was a fellow high school senior from a Detroit neighborhood known as Mexican Town. Her and Jack struck up a friendship first, which soon turned into a romantic relationship. They frequented the coffee shops, local music venues, and record stores of the area. They eventually married in 1996, and by the fall of 97, were already playing shows in a band together. Jack was the experienced musician, but Meg had never touched the drums until about a month before their first gig as the White Stripes. Rhythm obviously came naturally to Meg, and with Jack's guidance as a former drummer himself, she took to the instrument quickly. With only a couple of months' experience on her instrument, Meg knew she shouldn't be the star of the show, and she never really wavered from that position in the band. And that position allowed Jack to be the star he was destined to be. Similar to Ringo's star in the Beatles, she's just a drummer doing her job, providing the rhythm in a supporting role. It fit her quiet and modest personality. In an interview, Jack explained what playing with Meg was like in the early years, saying, quote, "She sort of played like a child because she never played drums before, and it seemed to be something that was really interesting right off the bat. I became really obsessed with it. I didn't want to change. I didn't want her to practice. I wanted it to stay childlike." It's sort of that thing, Picasso saying, "It'll take you a lifetime to learn how to paint like a child." I couldn't drum like that if I wanted to. I'd never played with a drummer like that, so it was very primitive and primal, so we stayed with it. We started writing songs. It came together really nicely. It became a great way for me to play the blues too and get away with it. Meg's modest drumming allowed for Jack's guitar to speak in many languages. The White Stripes' music is innovative inside these boundaries. They were designed that way, complementing Jack's guitar. On Elephant, there isn't too many examples of Meg flexing her drumming muscle, but it doesn't mean she didn't make her mark. Her style on most of the White Stripes' discography is to provide a rhythm and beat for the songs through a heavy wall of sound. It's a lot of steady crash cymbals and a lot of stops and starts, accenting Jack's guitar. You hear this a lot on the 13th track off of Elephant, titled "Girl, You Have No Faith in Medicine." For the main parts of the song, the choruses, Meg rides this simple beat over top of the crash cymbals, giving it a wall of sound feel to the rhythm. When Jack sings the verse lyrics, she provides a great dynamic in the song by stopping the drums dead in their tracks, but continues the tempo on the hi-hat. It's like Meg is guiding the song, stopping and starting, so you're not fatigued by the heaviness of the track. For the lyrical content in the song, it's one of the rare White Stripes tracks where Meg actually had some input. She was upset with Jack's take in it on the differences of genders in a relationship. The song is basically a metaphor about how men and women differ when it comes to encountering issues and problems when together. How men seem to be able to move on from relationship troubles easier, to not let it affect them for too long, while women seem to be bothered by it for longer. It lingers with them. Jack writes all this tongue-in-cheek, comparing it to medicine. Men are more easily able to get over the headache, aka the relationship issues. They're more willing to take the aspirin, the Tylenol, the acetaminophen, the quick fix, and the headache will go away. While women, on the other hand, are more reluctant, and even if they do take the quick pill, it's still not enough to take the pain away of the headache. They need a special sort of care. In the first verse, Jack writes, "Is there a way to find a cure for this, implanted in a pill? Is it just the name upon the bottle that determines if it will? Is the problem you're allergic to a well-familiar name? Do you have any problem with this one if the results are the same?" Jack also mentions the placebo effect, meaning that if you think you are taking medicine, you will feel better, even if the medicine contains no active ingredients. Sometimes the ability to get better is in your mind, but you think you need something to help the process. It's all in this girl to be well, and while she's refusing to take, quote, her medicine and being miserable, the answer's right there. Jack compares that to himself, where a fake pill or a placebo works just as well as anything for him, writing, "Give me a sugar pill and watch me just rattle down the street. Acetaminophen, you see the medicine. Girl, you have no faith in medicine." The song is a great example of Jack's writing ability, putting casual pharmacy rhetoric into rock poetry, and another example of the variance in lyric topics throughout the album. Meg actually took issue with what Jack was saying in the lyrics on "Girl, You Have No Faith in Medicine." Meg forced Jack to rewrite the song and edit some lines out, even refusing to play the song until he did. Jack compromised, and that's what you eventually hear on the final cut. Kind of makes you wonder what content was in the original. As a result, Meg has said that this is the least favorite song of hers in the band, and to tease her about it in their live shows, Jack will sometimes change the lyrics to "Meg, you have no faith in medicine." It's not just the mostly monotonous wall of sound and the occasional song edit that Meg offers on Elephant. She lends her voice to a couple of tracks as well. And that leads us to a big left turn on the record, and that's the 5th song in The Cold, Cold Night. Meg sings lead in this song, and compared to most of Elephant, there's no screeching guitar, no fast tempo, no blazing guitar solo, not even drums really. It's a simple song driven by a quiet guitar riff over top of what sounds like a bassy keyboard or something. The only drums in the song are the occasional ride cymbal hits, not even providing a beat until near the end. And the same goes with a little organ part making a quick appearance halfway through. The appeal to the song is the vocal melody and Meg's delivery. Meg deserves a lot of credit for stomaching the courage to do this one. Her voice is what's most prominent, and she's not hiding behind guitar or drums in the mix. Jack said he wrote the song specifically for Meg to sing, and that it took some convincing. He said that Meg doesn't like the sound of her voice and has never really had any singing aspirations, or songwriting aspirations for that matter. Jack talked about her shyness in an interview, saying, quote, "In songwriting and presenting something that you create to people, you kind of have to have an extroverted attitude and a little bit of ego or something, but not too much. You have to have enough that it makes you want to express yourself. It's almost a look at me kind of attitude. She just doesn't have that. She's very shy, and she's super polite, and she won't speak unless spoken to. That's not really the personality of a songwriter." With that personality, it's no wonder Meg was nervous to sing in The Cold, Cold Night, but eventually, after Jack's convincing and after the final mix and mastering was done on the song, she came around and eventually liked the finished product. In The Cold, Cold Night wasn't the only song off of Elephant that featured Meg singing. She would be one of 3 vocalists on another track that's off the beaten path for the White Stripes. Well, at this point, Off the Beaten Path is the beaten path for the White Stripes. This song is the 14th and last on Elephant. It's called Well, It's True That We Love One Another. It features singing from Jack and Meg, and a guest from the band The Headcoatees, Holly Golightly. The Headcoatees were an all-female British garage rock band in the 90s that saw mild success before breaking up in 1999. They were on the same label as the White Stripes for a while, and eventually played on a lot of shows together. Holly continued on as a solo artist, and ended up at Tilreg Studios in London at the same time as Jack and Meg. They all thought it would be fun to collaborate on something, probably never thinking they'd actually use the recording for any project. Well, It's True That We Love One Another was inspired by and recorded as an homage to the Mamas and Papas song Creek Alley. Actually, if you listen to the songs back to back, they're very, very similar. Of course, the Mamas and Papas came out of the 60s folk scene, and Jack writes this one in a similar vein, where those old folk songs featured people singing back and forth to each other in conversation. It was the first song recorded for Elephant. It was put down in November of 2001 at Tilreg Studios, months before the rest of the album, as a test of the studio's capabilities. The song has a goofy and real innocent feel to it, almost like a novelty song. It's an example of the White Stripes not really taking themselves too seriously. In the song, Jack and Holly are lovers and are in a bit of a spat. Meg chimes in every now and then and just asks them to get along. In the hook, all 3 of them sing, "Well, it's true that we love one another." Holly then adds, "I love Jack White like a little brother." Jack replies with, "Well, Holly, I love you too, but there's just so much that I don't know about you. Holly, give me some of your English lovin'." And then Holly, "If I did that, Jack, I'd have one in the oven. Why don't you go off and love yourself?" And then Jack again, "If I did that, Holly, there won't be anything left for anybody else." It has a feel like Jack and Holly are an old married couple in an argument. A funny example in the next part of the song has Holly singing, "Jack, it's too bad about the way you look." And then Jack responds with, "You know I gave that horse a carrot so he'd break your foot." Meg then chimes in as if she's sick of the banter, "Will the 2 of you cut it out and tell him what it's really all about?" It's a song you wouldn't expect to cap off an album like Elephant. It doesn't really encapsulate the feel of the record as a whole, and it's just another example of the White Stripes coming way out of left field and embracing their uniqueness. It wasn't the first time they used the last song on an album as a tribute to old folk and blues music from the past. On Stijl, it was Your Southern Can Is Mine, a Blind Willie McTell cover from the 1930s. By now, you've probably noticed Jack isn't really a fan of anything modern. His love of the old way of doing things ties right into his songwriting discipline of being authentic and true to himself, to write and play music with integrity. For example, part of the reason they chose to record Elephant at Toreg Studios was its antiquated equipment. In fact, they proudly flaunted that fact in the liner notes. No computers were used during the writing, recording, mixing, or mastering of this record, and none of the recording equipment was more recent than 1963. Jack's affinity for the old way of doing things isn't limited to recording either, but also songwriting. Jack doesn't follow the modern convention of writing in a biographical sense about his own life. His songwriting style is more of a tribute to songwriters from the early to mid-20th century about fictional stories. We've covered off 9 songs already on Elephant, and so far Jack has gotten into topics about gossip, childhood education, hooking up with girls, breaking up with girls, the placebo effect, running the gamut all the way to squirrels and acorns. And while it's true that we love one another, of course he never really had a love affair with Holly Golightly. He wrote about this made-up scenario of this romantic look at a seasoned relationship, a boy and a girl getting on each other's nerves and looking to a friend for an outside opinion. It's a fun song that sounds more like it was written in 1935 than in 2001. Even in Seven Nation Army, Jack wrote about 2 people he knew of in Detroit gossiping about each other, and then after drew the parallels to his own life. Jack has said that if he wrote biographical songs, it would be boring and it would likely be negative or sad, and that he'd rather not have to relive those feelings in their live shows over and over again. In an interview, Jack mentions something that always stayed with him, something profound he discovered in a book he read. The book explained how the old ways of songwriting contrasted with the gut-spilling troubadour confessionals we've grown accustomed to today. Jack explained further, saying, quote, "If you had asked kids in high school 100 years ago to write a song who knew nothing about music, 90 or 95% of them would have written about the Titanic or a mining disaster or something big to the community. But if you asked 100 kids right now to write a song who knew nothing about music or songwriting, they would all 100% write songs about themselves." And that's something that I don't really have an opinion on, about what that means, about how culture has changed. But I'm sure everybody listening to that statement can probably infer lots of narcissism and things that have to do with how we attack technology with social media now these days. Whereas before, 100 years ago, most people hadn't been more than 5 miles from their own home. They would assume that there's this grandiose life outside of their small town that they know very little about, that seems very exotic. But that's all at our fingertips now. He goes on further, saying, quote, "I think everyone sort of expects that the new Taylor Swift song is going to be about her dating John Mayer or something like that. And I think maybe it would be better if people wrote about something different." Jack has always been that way. Has always had a real bright spot for the past, of embracing the facets of songwriting that made his favorite artists so great. The Blind Willie McTells, the Sun Houses, the Bob Dylans. It's part of that discipline, the minimalism Jack adopted as part of an ethos for his life. Jack White was born John Anthony Gillis, the youngest of 10 children, in Detroit, Michigan, July of 1975. He grew up in a very religious Catholic family, the only white family in a Hispanic neighborhood. He was an altar boy in his youth and seriously considered becoming a priest, even turning down an acceptance into a seminary school, partly because he knew he wouldn't be able to take his guitar amp with him. Jack credits his parents and growing up Catholic for developing his sense of work ethic. His parents were old enough to grow up in the Great Depression and pass down those sensibilities. And he said that Catholic guilt really instilled a sense of not really being allowed to enjoy nice things when they happen to you. Jack's older brothers were his main musical influences growing up, inheriting their old instruments they abandoned. At the time he was in first grade, he picked up his first instrument, the drums, after discovering one of his brother's old kits in their attic. He was mostly exposed to classical music as a child, but as he transitioned into his teens, he was transfixed into the world of old blues music and 60s rock that would eventually influence the sound of the White Stripes. Jack was a short-haired kid with braces, not the most popular kid growing up in an all-Mexican grade school and transitioning to an all-black high school. Jack found comfort in discovering obscure blues artists like Blind Willie McTell, Robert Johnson, but especially Son House. As Jack would later say in an interview, he only really dabbled in the blues until Son House opened up the genre for him, saying, quote, "Then I heard Son House's a cappella song, Grinnin' in Your Face. That was a transformative moment. There's nothing there, just that voice. And what he was singing made so much sense to me. Don't care what other people are saying about you, what they think. It was what I had been struggling through my whole life. I never really liked the same music anyone else did. It all exploded for me after Son House." In the documentary It Might Get Loud, he went further into what hearing Grinnin' in Your Face for the first time meant to him, saying, quote, "This spoke to me in 1,000 different ways. I didn't know that you could do that, just singing and clapping. And it meant everything. It meant everything about rock and roll, everything about expression, creativity, and art. One man against the world in one song." When Jack was about 14, he bought a 4-track reel-to-reel and mixer from his brother Joe. With it, he got his first taste of recording the music that he was playing. In a speech he gave at a Grammy Awards presentation later on, Jack says he still carries those lessons he learned then with him today, saying, quote, "In that bedroom, I learned a lot about how to do things under restriction. Do things on 4-track and bounce back and forth. Record something and erase it if it wasn't good enough. You erase it, and it was gone forever," which is something I think has become few and far between in the new generation, where you can record 1,000,000 times and just keep all of them. I still work that way, and that kind of restriction, I think, is really important. At the age of 15, Jack began a 3-year furniture upholstery apprenticeship with a family friend, Brian Muldoon. Muldoon took Jack under his wing and would be a great influence on his life. He would expose Jack to punk rock for the first time, even goading him into forming their own band called the Upholsterers. The only problem was Muldoon could only play the drums, so Jack, having the experience of messing around with his brother's guitars growing up, fell into being a guitar player by default. Even as an upholsterer, Jack's eccentricity shined through. Him and Muldoon decided to record a single of their music onto vinyl, only press 100 copies, and hide them inside the furniture they were restoring. They made them hard to find on clear vinyl with transparent covers, and to this day, not one has been found. Once Jack finished his apprenticeship, he formed his own one-man upholstery company titled Third Man Upholstery. Everything in his company was color-coded, from his clothes to his van to his tools. They had to be either white, yellow, or black as an aesthetic presentation. Once again, he thrived under the aspects of restriction. He even wrote his bills in crayon, hid poems addressed to other upholsterers inside the furniture he restored. Those creative aspects didn't really translate to successful business practices, and his upholstery career never really took off. Part of that eccentricity is what makes Jack and the White Stripes so appealing. You believe it. Jack seems so authentic in his weirdness that you're not put off by it like other artists. You get the sense that the gimmicky stuff, like the color scheme in the White Stripes, is truly part of his and Meg's personality, so it's not off-putting. It was as Jack was a senior in high school when he first met Meg White at the Memphis Smoke restaurant, where she worked at during an open mic poetry night. They soon started dating, and within a few years they were married and began the White Stripes together. The first song they ever played together was a cover of David Bowie's Moon Age Daydream, but the first song they actually wrote was titled Screwdriver. As Jack later said in an interview, the songwriting process never changed from how they first wrote that song, saying, quote, "There was a red screwdriver sitting on the table. We wrote this song that afternoon, and it hasn't changed at all since that day. When we play a song I wrote, it's the White Stripes covering a Jack White song. That's the best way to describe it. I write most of my songs on piano and acoustic guitar, then I show it to Meg, and it's like, okay, how can we do this on stage? That becomes the way we do it from then on." I talked about how Jack doesn't like to write songs about himself. He draws inspiration from other people, other stories. or as in the case of their very first song, other objects around them. The main topics in their songs are not about personal experiences, but it's not like they can't draw from those experiences for inspiration. A great example of this off of Elephant would be the third single on the album, the 9th track on the listing, Hardest Button to Button. Jack got the idea to write this song from something his dad used to say to him when Jack was a kid. His dad would talk about Jack's Uncle Harold, who was sort of the odd man out of the family, the black sheep, saying he had a 10-button vest, but he could only fasten 8. Jack thought it would work as a great metaphor for a song about a kid growing up in a broken home, about a child trying to figure out where his place was in a dysfunctional family, and the fact he's losing attention because there's a new baby around. Jack didn't grow up in a broken home, but he put his headspace into his Uncle Harold's and imagined what it would have been like to have a rough childhood. It was a quick song to write, one of the few that actually began with Jack sitting at the piano and genuinely being struck by an almost completely formed idea. He wrote the lyrics at home, and just like most of the songs in the White Stripes, fleshed out his signature rhythm in the studio with Meg. The lyrics can be interpreted a few ways, but what's for certain is it's about the jealousy a sibling has once a baby is born into the family and getting most of the attention. The song starts with the lyrics. We started living in an old house. My ma gave birth, and we were checking it out. It was a baby boy, so we bought him a toy. The second verse explains the resentment the brother feels. He started crying. It sounded like an earthquake. It didn't last long because I stopped it. I grabbed a rag doll and stuck some little pins in it. One easy interpretation of it is really dark. It seems like the older sibling did something really bad to the baby brother. In the fourth verse, Jack writes about the naivete of the older brother doing something bad, how he's able to get away with it, but it still doesn't change the fact he's still feeling rejected and ignored, writing, well, it's easy when you don't know better. You think it's sleazy, then put it in a short letter. We keep warm, but there's just something wrong when you just feel like you're the hardest button to button. And then in the final verse, he caps it off by what you could interpret it as Jack explaining the coffin they buried the dead brother, writing, I got a backyard with nothing in it, except a stick, a dog, and a box with something in it. The hardest button to button. For Jack, growing up in a family with 9 other siblings, I imagine it wasn't hard for him to put himself into a jealous brother's shoes. It's dark stuff, especially for what was a pretty successful single for the White Stripes. The song eventually reached number 23 on the UK singles chart and number 8 on the US Billboard Modern Rock Tracks chart. Its success was in large part due to the unique music video. The video used animation to create the effect of dozens of drum kits and guitar amps multiplying to the rhythm of the song as Jack and Meg perform around random spots in the Upper West Side of New York City. In total, they used 32 identical drum kits, 32 guitar amps, and 16 microphone stands for the shoot, which took over 3 16-hour days on location. If you look closely, you'll see Jack with a black cast on his arm. He had broken his index finger in a car accident while on tour just before the video shoot. They even reflected that aspect on the cover art for the single, where you see Jack's crooked and broken index finger pointing down. In 2011, Time magazine named it one of the 30 best music videos of all time. Meg has even said it's her favorite of all the White Stripes videos. Going into the recording of Elephant, Jack and Meg had come up with a theme to the album, something to encompass what message they were going for, something linear you could get out of every song. They came up with a simple phrase, Death of the Sweetheart. It's a message you see throughout Jack's career in his songs. I talked about his affinity for the old way of doing things, his disdain for new technology that makes things easier at the sacrifice of quality. But to Jack, that phrase also means the death of being the simple, nice boy next door or girl next door. The death of the archetype of the person who grew up in early 20th century small-town America. Jack further expanded on the death of the sweetheart notion in an interview, saying, quote, It wasn't a political statement so much as a social idea about the attitude. Teenage girls with tattoos and body piercings, and the white boy from the suburbs who adopts a ghetto accent. There's this whole attitude that you have to be hard, like right out of the gate. And the sweetness and gentlemanly ideas are really going away. I'm sort of scared to bring up this notion because I don't want it to sound like I'm some sort of conservative, old-fashioned person, but I've gotten the feeling that parenting and the way people are brought up now is getting away from these natural ideas and natural instincts in the male or female personalities. They're being sacrificed for the idea of equality or good parenting or relaxed parenting. I don't want to be like my dad was. He was always on my case about getting a job or whatever. So that means I'm parenting like, oh, whatever, let them figure it out for themselves. Do you know what I mean? There's this relaxing of natural ideals. I'm just bringing up the question, really. What is natural about being feminine? What is natural about being masculine? And what's fake about it? To me, it appears Jack is seeing this whole identity he cherishes in himself go away. That whole nice guy, boy next door, just doesn't seem cool in today's society, and so he sees it slipping away. Jack is sad about the death of his sweetheart, and that fondness for what would normally be called a conservative viewpoint, the old way of doing things, makes him a rebel in a sense. It sounds contradictory, but embracing and modeling this persona on archetypes from generations before is rebellious, when it's now the cool thing, the common thing, to be anti-establishment, to say fuck the police, to be this womanizing type of guy who only cares about material wealth. And on Elephant, there's no better reflection of Jack's fondness for the old sweetheart archetype than on the 6th track off the album, titled I Want to Be the Boy to Warm Your Mother's Heart. It's a melancholy, mellow song with a little bit of country flavor in it. It could almost be a Rod Stewart outtake. And it's about a young teenage boy loving his girlfriend, but frustrated with her mom's lack of approval. He only wants to get acceptance from the mom and to be a good influence on this girl. But he seems genuinely frustrated because she isn't interested in him and won't give him any chance. The song is directed at the girlfriend and not the mom, as a way of telling her that he wants the mom to like him. It really nails what it's like to spend a weekend at a girl's parents' house when her mom is acting like you aren't good enough for her. In the first verse, Jack writes, "We've been sitting in your backyard for hours, but she won't even come out and say hi, while my mother baked a little cake for you and even dreaded when you said goodbye. What kind of cartwheels do I have to pull? What kind of joke should I lay on her now? I'm inclined to go finish high school just to make her notice that I'm around." Jack does a great job of making the story sound really innocent with that little line of finishing high school, and even also contrasting the way his own mother took a liking to his girlfriend baking a cake for her. Jack ends the song again in another way that paints a really innocent picture. The main character is self-aware. He doesn't get angry at the mom, doesn't inflate his ego and tell himself he's so great. He simply just wants a chance, writing, "I never said I was the heir to a fortune. I never claimed to have any looks. But these kind of things must be important because somebody ripped out my page in your telephone book. I want to warm her heart." The track is a rare piano song for the White Stripes. They later used piano a lot more in the band, but at this point in their history, didn't feature it as much. You hear the similarities of the piano in this song and Jack's later solo work. The country blues flavor is only enhanced later in the song with the addition of the slide guitar. Jack used a slide guitar for the solo in Seven Nation Army, but that was far from country. That was more of an in-your-face technique to get an interesting sound with distortion. It's cool how Jack employs the different ways a slide can be used. And in I Want to Be the Boy to Warm Your Mother's Heart, he uses it in a much more classic country blues fashion, catching the listener off guard with this interesting twangy sound over top of Meg's steady crash cymbal beat. And again, Jack doesn't rip this Jimi Hendrix, Eddie Van Halen virtuoso solo. It's a classic White Stripes simple melody that lends itself to the song as a whole. He's not showing off by any stretch. One thing great about the White Stripes is the diversity in their music. Once they got a taste of mainstream success with Fell in Love with a Girl, they didn't stick to that formula. They didn't sit down and say, well, now we got to exclusively write short, fast, and heavy garage rock songs. No, as much as they limit themselves in terms of technology and ways of coming up with songs, they absolutely don't put limits on what their art turns out to be. On Elephant, you've got the garage rock sound covered, you got slower ballads, love songs, angry songs, piano songs, country folk, blues and rock, even spoken word. Like I said earlier, off the beaten path is the beaten path for the White Stripes. Jack's method of writing is tapping into the extremes of his emotions. Just as how great it is to tap into the feeling of acceptance and joy in a love song, it's therapeutic to let out anger and frustration in a heavy and loud punk rock banger. The whole gamut of emotions are necessary components in music, and that's why you don't see a lot of the same topics being covered in the White Stripes. As Jack said in an interview, it's the easier path to just be happy-go-lucky in your songwriting, but you can't push yourself and grow as a person without allowing all emotions to exist, saying, quote, "I often think that society is missing out on something right now to think that anger and hostility are things that are in the violent realm of emotions, that they're all completely 100% bad and should be avoided at all cost. I don't think that's true at all. Those emotions are very much relevant in, say, blues music. They're very much relevant in painting and roll, punk rock, all of that. If they would have ignored those emotions and not thought about them and expressed them, they wouldn't have been able to explore those ideas." And that leads us to the 12th track off of Elephant, a song inspired by a classic movie in the horror genre, a story about jealousy, bipolar disorder, and murder. It's the song titled "The Air Near My Fingers." From my research, Jack has actually never come out and said this, but the song seems to be inspired by the classic Alfred Hitchcock movie, Psycho. In the movie, the main antagonist is a young man, Norman Bates, who runs a cheap motel along with his overbearing mother. Spoiler alert, eventually he kills his mom and her lover over jealousy, but unable to bear the guilt, recreates his mother in his own mind as an alternate personality. This mother personality is just as possessive and jealous as her real mom was when she was alive, and so whenever Norman feels attracted to a woman, the mother part of his personality comes out and kills her in real life. Take it with a grain of salt, just like all interpretations of these songs, but Jack writes about Norman in the first person. In the first verse, he explains the dull existence of running the hotel that doesn't see a lot of business, just like in Psycho, writing, "Life is so boring, it's really got me snoring. I'm wearing out the flooring in a cheap hotel." In the second verse, Jack writes about Norman's refusal to grow up, maintaining the characteristics of a child. "Don't you remember, you told me in December that a boy is not a man until he makes a stand. Well, I'm not a genius, but maybe you'll remember this. I never said I ever wanted to be a man." In the final verse, it all comes together. Norman is submissive to the mother's side of his personality. He allows her to take over to do the crazy things. He really loves her, but he still can't help himself from being shocked by her actions and being nervous when the mother's side of him comes around. "My mom is so caring. She's really got me staring at all the crazy little things she does for sure. And I can't seem to think of another kind of love that a boy could ever get from anyone from her. I get nervous when she comes around." Jack's guitar on the track is muddy and dense, and he wrote a simple Wild Things style riff to accompany the dark lyrics. And you sense the horror movie inspiration with the instrumental breaks in between the verses. Meg provides a feel of anticipation with her tom-tom hits, with Jack's unnerving guitar, even adding random piano notes on the second break to give you a feeling you're hearing the score in the theater watching Norman Bates creep up on some poor woman. Again, separating themselves from albums in the past, they use circus organ-like keyboards to provide some of the rhythm in the verses, and then an effect is used on the keyboard to play an interesting but very simple, catchy solo. Overall, though, you don't really get the sense it's as dark of a song as it really is until you dig deeper, until you really listen to what Jack is singing about. On the surface, it's actually pretty catchy. Jack likes to work quick. He likes that feeling of urgency and the fact that it's just him and Meg in the band. It allows him that freedom. He knows these songs will have to be transferred to the live stage. He can't have 10 different guitar tracks, 5 harmonies, and an orchestra on all the songs. In an interview after the White Stripes disbanded years later, Jack talked about the songwriting lessons learned from that simplicity, saying, quote, "I don't have people to help me, a full band to help me. I'm writing my own songs, not someone else writing them for me. So I have to figure out how to do this quickly and get my point across, sometimes very simplistically. It was good training for me as a songwriter to be in a two-piece band like the White Stripes for so long, and as a performer because I never had a safety net. I didn't have other people to rely on, we didn't have a set list, and we were playing on popular music, and also how it related to the blues. All these things were a great training for me as a songwriter." Probably the most stripped-down song off of Elephant leads us to the 7th track, titled You've Got Her in Your Pocket. It's just Jack and his guitar, almost like he could have written it one afternoon and recorded it in the first take. When you dive into the lyrics, you could interpret a similar darkness like the air near my fingers, but it's almost more closer to a different song off of Elephant, sort of like a yin to the yang of In the Cold, Cold Night. In that song, as I mentioned before, it's simple with barely any drums and Meg's voice providing the main focus. 2 tracks later, on You've Got Her in Your Pocket, you get a song where Jack's voice is the main focus, with only an acoustic guitar to accompany him. It's like the listener is a fly on the wall in Jack's living room as he plays the stripped-down song. You could look at it as one of the darker White Stripes songs, blurring the line between caring for someone and wanting to own them, but based on the vulnerability of Jack's whimpering voice, as well as the soft acoustic guitar, I think it's much more innocent than that. Jack's vocal delivery is great. You can hear the sadness in his voice, and You've Got Her in Your Pocket. It's about a boy who loves a girl very much, and he doesn't want to lose her, so he keeps her on a tight leash. But the way Jack sings it, you can't help but feel sorry for him. It's an interesting dichotomy. In the first verse, Jack writes about the relationship being dysfunctional with, "Nobody ever told you that it was the wrong way to trick a woman. Make her feel she did it her way. And you'll be there if she ever feels blue, and you'll be there when she finds someone new." Right away, it appears as if he's trying too hard to contain her, and that she'll inevitably leave him because of it. In the second verse, it's confirmed she really liked him with, "The smile on your face made her think she had the right one. Then she thought she was sure by the way you two could have fun. But now she might leave, like she's threatened before. Grab hold of her fast before her feet leave the floor, and she's out the door." It's a dysfunctional relationship. In the third verse, he tries to convince himself he was just lucky enough to be with her in the first place, but the thought of her with someone else just kills him, writing, "And in your own mind, you know you're lucky just to know her, and in the beginning, all you wanted was to show her, but now you're scared, you think she's running away. You search in your hand for something clever to say. Don't go away, 'cause I want to keep you in my pocket, where there's no way out. Put it in the safe and lock it, 'cause it's home, sweet home." He's crazy about her, but he just can't express it. He kind of already gave up. It's too late, and he knows it's his own fault. I think it's an issue many men can relate to in relationships, not being in touch with their emotions and not being able to express them. You don't hear many contemporary songs and pop rock music that are this self-aware, this honest about real things that happen in real relationships. It's a boyfriend with good intentions, but not being able to make the girl know how much she truly means to him. There's no happy ending. It seems as if she just fades away, likely to find a new man, leaving the main character in despair. The very thing that he wanted to prevent, the breakup, was caused by the method that he is using to prevent it. It's a pretty heavy topic, but the simple way it's recorded, just Jack and his guitar, makes the character in the song seem that much more vulnerable. It gives the character a sweetness. It's clear that Jack has quite a unique affinity for the past, and his musical influences really help shape the White Stripes find their sound. You could argue that the White Stripes sound is boiled down to music that injects pure sentiments of the past with a fresh sound that's all their own. It wasn't an accident either. The White Stripes music is a very knowing homage and tribute to blues music of the past that valued truth and integrity and authenticity. Part of honoring that past was their cover songs that they recorded over the years. It started with their first album, covering Robert Johnson, Son House, Bob Dylan, and Cab Calloway. How many bands can you point to where 3 of their songs on an album are covers from the 1930s? Again, on their second album, To Stijl, you see 2 covers, another one from Son House and one from Blind Willie McTell. For White Blood Cells, they deliberately didn't put any covers on it, trying to simplify their sound, but on Elephant, they went back to it with 1 cover on the album. It's an odd choice from the outset. It's not a cover of an old blues song from the 30s. It's a Burt Bacharach cover from the 60s. It's the 4th track on the album. It's I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself. Burt Bacharach originally just composed the song and never actually recorded it himself, but both Dionne Warwick and Dusty Springfield each laid down versions that were probably more in line with what Bacharach had in mind than with the White Stripes' ripping version. The White Stripes' rendition of the pop classic seems to represent both an embrace and intentional distance from groovy 60s culture. You get Bacharach's infectious melodies, but also a handful of guitar riffs and solos that thrillingly wrestle with the original's hooks. In an interview, Jack explained why they chose to cover such an unconventional White Stripes-like artist in Burt Bacharach, saying, quote, "I really love him. I love his songwriting. With this particular song, Meg was fond of it and wanted us to do it, and we started to do it live. I love it because I started recognizing that it was really a blues song in its purest form, when you strip down the Bacharach production. The essence of the song was blues, so I really adapted to that." The song is bluesy in a way that it depicts the feelings of a man after a breakup. He's in such despair that he doesn't remember what it's like to live without this woman, a main focal point in his life. It starts off with, "I just don't know what to do with myself. Don't know just what to do with myself. I'm so used to doing everything with you, planning everything for 2. And now that we're through, I just don't know what to do with my time. I'm so lonesome for you, it's a crime. Going to a movie only makes me sad. Parties make me feel as bad. When I'm not with you, I just don't know what to do." In an interview, Jack talked about looking for songs that provide him a deep meaning and feeling inside him before deciding to cover them. Once he finds that, covering it is almost like putting on a warm blanket, saying, quote, "I like trying to translate something else into what we do and making it our own. I feel better playing someone else's music than I feel playing my own any day of the week." With their version, Jack and Meg provide a great dynamic between soft and sad and heavy and angry. The guitars veer from a basic strum to car horn fuzz, which makes you forget Burt Bacharach even had a hand in writing the song at its heaviest point. I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself was the second single the White Stripes put out off of Elephant. It didn't come close to making the splash the first single did, with Seven Nation Army, but it reached the top 40 in New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and on the US Billboard Modern Rock Tracks chart. The black and white music video was directed by Sofia Coppola and featured model Kate Moss pole dancing in just her black bra and black underwear. If you look at Jack White's career in music, a common thread can be found weaved through the strangeness and eccentricity of the man. It was something Jack discovered early on in his apprenticeship as an upholsterer. It was during one day, Jack was at the impressionable age of 15, cleaning and sweeping up, when he came across a couch that was being worked on in the upholstery shop. An epiphany happened, and it had to do with the mystical properties of the number 3. In an instant, a light bulb went off in Jack's head that the number 3 could represent something bigger in life as a metaphor. Jack remembered the moment in an interview with The Guardian, saying, quote, "It was a Vladimir Kagan couch. The fabric was pink with silver threads. It had 3 staples tamping the fabric down, left, right, and center. And I just stared at it for 10 minutes. It became hypnotic. This was the minimum amount of staples I could put to hold this fabric down. The number 3 exemplifies the almost iconic, mysterious perfection that cannot be obtained. A table has to have 3 legs or else it falls down. A traffic light has 3 lights. A car wheel can stay on with 3 bolts. It goes on and on. There are these 3 elements to everything, and if you can discover what those 3 are as your structure, then you're on the right path." In a different interview, Jack explained further, saying, quote, "That sort of image has been burned in my brain. I think about that probably once a week, that image of those 3 staples, and it's affected everything. I force myself to do anything that I create artistically, music-wise, whatever it is, I force it through the funnel of that idea. I'll have 3 lines, or 3 concepts in a song, or I'll wrap it around storytelling and a melody and a rhythm. The White Stripes, the whole band was based on the number 3. As I explained earlier, Jack's obsession with the number 3 falls in line with Jack's fondness for minimalism. In any of Jack's creative outputs, he's looking at it as not anything more than what you absolutely need. As Jack explained in that interview, it's the freedom he gets when he limits himself, almost like he's tricking his brain. He goes on, saying it's not a rule set in stone, but a starting point, saying, quote, "There's 2 ways about it. One way can be too pretentious if you take it too seriously, if you become pedantic about it. But I looked at it as a way of limiting myself so I can create more things, more songs, because I'm so boxed in. My brain is forced to work with the tools that are at hand. I can't let some engineers fix it or let the 3 other members in the band cover it up with what they're playing or whatever. I'm in this box by myself, or me and Meg are in this box." Let's look at some examples of how the number 3 has affected Jack and the way he's used it. White was born into a very religious Catholic family, so of course there's the Holy Trinity, one of the most important symbols in all of Christianity. Blues music is framed by 3 chords, the 1, 4, and 5, aka the tonic, dominant, subdominant, and it forms the 12-bar blues. You see the number 3 all over the first single they put out on their first album, The Big 3 Killed My Baby. It's the 3rd song on the album, uses 3 chords in 3 verses and 3 choruses. Their 3rd album was recorded in 3 days. Of course, it's used as a color code with the white stripes, red, white, and black, and those colors are used with triangles, the 3 corners, in the 7 Nation Army video. Jack likes to throw the number 3 at the end of his name as well, and just as a band as a whole, the White Stripes sound is a great example of rock stripped down to its most basic 3 parts: melody, rhythm, and lyrics, the cornerstones of songwriting. 3 also applies to their main instrumentation, guitar, drums, and vocals. So when it comes to the album Elephant, you know there's going to be some hints of the number 3 somewhere. And that leads us to the final song to talk about in the podcast. It's one of the songs most beloved by White Stripes fans, the longest song the band ever recorded at 7 minutes and 19 seconds. Coming in as the 8th track on the album, it's Ball and Biscuit. It's a very bluesy song, structured simply by just 3 chords in that 12-bar blues fashion. It's probably the closest Elephant gets to straight blues. The song also gives Jack 7 minutes to show off the orchestral possibilities of amp violence with these blazing guitar solos following the more chill verses. A contrast commonality you see throughout the White Stripes catalog. Lyrically, you hear the number 3 mentioned right off the get-go in the first phrase with, "It's quite possible that I'm your 3rd man, girl, but it's a fact that I'm the 7th son." 3rd Man is a reference to Jack's record label, 3rd Man Records, which at the point of recording Elephant had existed for about a year. The label was obviously named after Jack's affinity for the number 3, but also from an old 1940s film titled The 3rd Man, featuring Orson Welles. In the next phrase, the 7th son comes from a few different places. First off, Jack was the 7th born son in his family. It's also a reference to a Chicago blues song from Willie Dixon titled The 7th Son, which probably stems from the folklore that a lot of blues players sang about over the years. It's an American folk legend that the 7th son of a 7th son would be granted supernatural powers. In Ball and Biscuit, that first phrase in the song, which by the way is repeated over and over throughout the track, explains that he has this girl who is ambivalent towards him, but he insistently tries to impress her with his claim to be a 7th son. Over simple thudding drums and Jack's spoken word delivery, the lyrics go on to the chorus about a drug-riddled night with his female companion, with, "Let's have a ball and a biscuit, sugar, and take our sweet little time about it. Let's have a ball, girl, and take our sweet little time about it. Tell everybody in the place to just get out, and we'll get clean together, and I'll find me a soapbox where I can shout it." Ball and a biscuit could refer to doing drugs, ball being speedball or cocaine, while the biscuit is referring to quaaludes or ecstasy. In the song, it's the main character asking this girl to party with him, and later in the chorus, it's all this sexual innuendo. The whole song oozes this cockiness and sexiness that you don't get a lot in other more modest White Stripes tracks. Even on Elephant, there's the Boy Next Door songs and I Want to Be the Boy to Warm Your Mother's Heart, or in Hypnotize, singing that he wants to be your right-hand man until your hands get old. But then Ball and Biscuit comes on and blows you away with its I don't give a shit attitude, amplified by the delivery in Jack's vocal performance. In the second verse, that attitude continues with the lyrics, read it in the newspaper, ask your girlfriends and see if they know that my strength is tenfold, girl. I'll let you see if you want to before you go. And then Jack ends the lyrical side of the song with, and right now you could care less about me, but soon enough you will care by the time I'm done. Yeah, you just wait. Yeah, stick around. You'll figure it out. I love how uncharacteristically bold and cocky Jack is, too, when it comes to the blazing solos. Right before the second solo, he says, yeah, I can think of one or two things to say about it. All right, listen. And while the listener is trying to recover from having their face melted off, Jack nonchalantly follows the solo with the line, you get the point now? Well, obviously having all these drug and sexual undertones, the phrase ball and biscuit in itself actually comes from a piece of old recording equipment. Jack has said that he got the phrase from the name of a vintage microphone hanging from the roof they used at Touareg Studios to record Elephant. Ball and Biscuit was never released as a single, but it became a concert staple for the band and is a fan favorite to this day. It was voted in a 2012 Rolling Stone magazine readers poll to be the greatest Jack White song by a landslide. Elephant was released on April 1st, 2003. The album garnered critical acclaim and commercial success, earning a nomination for Album of the Year and a win for Best Alternative Music Album at the 46th Grammy Awards in 2004, peaking at number 6 in the US Billboard charts and topping the UK album charts as well. Elephant settled the debates that the White Stripes were here to stay. They weren't a flash in the mainstream pan with white blood cells. Jack and Meg titled it Elephant because they thought the animal represented both of their personalities on stage and in real life, the myth and the ideas people have about elephants, its power and majesty, subtle and innocent, clumsy yet brilliant. In later years, the album has often been cited as the White Stripes' best work and one of the best albums of the 2000s. Rolling Stone magazine ranked it 390th on its list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, and later the 5th best of the decade. The band would follow up Elephant with 2 more albums, Get Behind Me Satan in 2005 and Icky Thump in 2007, both earning them Grammy Awards for Best Alternative Rock Album again. The White Stripes dissolved in 2011 after a lengthy hiatus from performing and recording. They denied any artistic differences or health issues, but cited, quote, a myriad of reasons, mostly to preserve what is beautiful and special about the band. Earlier in the band's history, Jack prophesied the way they'd go out, saying in an interview, quote, if we cross some line where we just look at each other on stage and it's worthless because we're so far away from where we started, then we're just going to have to stop. I refuse to beat a dead horse or do it just for the money. I couldn't live like that. And that's part of what makes them so great. They talk the talk of artist integrity, but walk the walk when it comes down to it. Jack didn't try to carry on the White Stripes without Meg. They were kindred spirits. The White Stripes is Jack and Meg. It's easy to point to Elephant as the White Stripes' best work because it has their biggest hit, Seven Nation Army, on it, but the album is much more than that. Elephant saw a maturity in the band and the songwriting more than the minimalistic rock sound of White Blood Cells and more than the polished pop twist to their blues rock sound onto Stijl on their debut self-titled album. It was all of that and more. For 2 weeks at Touareg Studios in London, England, the White Stripes boxed themselves in. They restricted themselves with only an 8-track recorder, all analog recording equipment dating no later than the early 1960s. They captured the sound of their Detroit roots without losing any of their blues influence to their framework. They stayed true to their minimalist ethos while not being a slave to zero experimentation. They successfully fought the tempting disease of technology and ease of use. Elephant kept their carefully crafted mythology alive. Their success only made them more mysterious. What the hell was a garage rock band from Detroit, a two-piece, a brother and sister, or maybe an ex-husband and wife, wearing only red, white, and black, refusing to record digitally, doing on top of the charts, performing at the Grammy Awards, and having one of the biggest songs in the world? They never took the easy route, and that's why they'll be in the rock pantheon with their heroes instead of fading into obscurity. Jack summed it up best in an interview with Conan O'Brien, saying, quote, "Of all the books and all the movies and the documentaries and all that stuff that are made about the people that we are interested in or we think accomplished something amazing, who wants to hear that they took the easy way out? Who wants to hear that they cheated?" The sound of the White Stripes is all wrong. There's no bass, there's basic primal drumming, the strained vocals. Most of the lyrics don't mesh with the bombastic guitars, but it's not just eccentricity for eccentricity's sake. It's an exposure of humanity that listeners relate to. You buy their authenticity. At the dawn of the internet age, Jack was a man from another era. He bemoaned the death of the sweetheart, badmouthed modern technology. Meg said little in interviews. All you needed to know about her came out in her performance. The joy in her face as she pounded the drums, the way she drained the bottle of whiskey next to her kit. She was the heart of the group, the engine and the groove. Success only amplified all the qualities that made the White Stripes unique. And it's why the White Stripes are the last great mysterious band in rock and roll. Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you'd like to keep up to date with everything I got going on with this channel, be sure to follow my Instagram page. Also, I do have a YouTube channel where I condense individual stories from my podcast into short video form. So please like and subscribe on there as well. Thanks again.